Hi, Lauren. Thanks so much. And thank you for PrivSec Global for hosting this great event. As Lauren said, we're going to be discussing U.S. privacy law and specifically state-level approaches to data privacy. We'll focus first on current state-level laws and regulations and talk about what might be coming up next in a few years. As Lauren said, I'm a policy director at Georgetown Law, and in that capacity, I work both with federal and state lawmakers and regulators on privacy questions. I'm really pleased to be joined by a wonderful panel of experts today, and I'm going to turn it over to each of them to let them introduce themselves briefly, and then we'll just jump right in. So first, I would invite up Ross Parker.
Thanks, Jeff. My name is Ross Parker. I'm the head of privacy operations for S&P Global. In my role, I focus, much like Jeff does, kind of globally and across the United States, primarily on the operationalization of our privacy program, the strategic direction and initiative of what our privacy and data program looks like, and really kind of working closely with our government affairs team on how we can help effectuate change in the privacy sector as it relates to federal law or the various state laws.
Wonderful. And next I'd invite up Ariel Garcia.
Thank you. My name is Ariel Garcia. I am Chief Privacy Officer at Worldwide. I also work on the operationalization and development of our privacy program. As a global media agency, we also work with advertiser clients. And so a lot of what we do is support our clients in navigating their needs and their obligations, as well as working with the industry at large to understand and adapt as the regulatory landscape continues to evolve.
Thanks so much. And last, Dean Gonzalez.
Thanks, Jeff. Thanks for having me today. I'm Dean Gonzalez. I'm the CRO at Active Navigation. We are an enterprise software company that helps a lot of the practitioners out there effectuate the what and the how once they get past the why of some of the data privacy laws that may be at a state or federal, local level. And so we work with everybody from Equifax to the Marine Corps to help them govern their information and make sure they're operating responsibly with individuals' data.
So we've not got a whole lot of time, and I want to just jump right in. We're talking about state approaches to privacy law generally, but of course, while there have been about 25 states who have started dabbling in this area, there's sort of one that overshadows most of the most of the conversation. That's California. And California really changed the privacy landscape with Ccpa, and then just doubled down and really changed it again with the CPRA. And so maybe, Dean, I'd turn it to you and to Ross and Ariel as well to just talk about, what does compliance look like, both with the CCPA, now with the new CPRA obligations, but also in a landscape that's changing so rapidly?
Well, I'll start with maybe being one of the few people in California, where I currently reside now. It's been kind of a whirlwind, right? California is obviously a massive state, and so the CCPA had everyone's attention domestically and globally. And then the CPRA comes on board when the CCPA really hadn't even had time to take effect in terms of its enforcement. So it's been a shifting landscape. And I think for practitioners, one of the challenges we'll probably talk about today is, do you build for the ceiling or the floor, or how do you understand sort of the patchwork of all the states, and really which regime do you build according to? And from a technology perspective, one of the things we're seeing is that really requires organizations to think differently about how they collect, maintain, minimize, and govern their data, because if you have information that pertains to a patchwork of privacy laws, and you don't really need that information, really puts a lot of pressure on your business to be compliant. So we think just from a technological perspective, this is a really significant challenge, and the new California regulations really will double down on that, as you said, because there is the enforcement mechanism that's there. And that was one of the things that was always a question about the CCPA, was how is enforcement going to happen? So I think it's going to really accelerate the need to become compliant much more quickly with the new regime.
I would also add, one of the things, certainly in the advertising and marketing space, that we've seen play out over the course of the last year is this debate over the definition of sale and what constitutes a sale under CCPA. CPRA adds, I guess, what I would call some clarity around some of what some companies might be seeing as loopholes right now, right? So the definition of or what's included in an opt-out, including the sharing of data for cross-context behavioral advertising, is likely going to be a hot topic headed into CPRA, whereas under CCPA, what we saw is different partners that we work with. When I say partners, I mean the platforms, publishers, et cetera, taking different positions on whether or not they're selling and how they're supporting advertisers that might not want to sell or engage in sale of data. So I think that will be a space that continues to evolve leading up to CPRA.
And you make a great point, because the biggest thing substantively that changed when the CCPA came in was this idea of a sale. And we have this conversation with our executive leadership for months leading up to the CCPA, that under any other privacy law, any other definition globally of the sale of personal data, we would have said no, absolutely not us. We're a financial data provider. Like, this is not, we're not in personal data sale. But it really changed the game. And we've had, because of one or two products or one or two services that we might provide, we've had to take the level of compliance up for the whole company. And when you look at CCPA, you look at CPRA, and I might be jumping ahead and looking at like Washington and New York. As a multinational company, you start to think, well, how do I comply? Or why would I comply with 50 different regimes in the United States? And when I'm doing a benchmark to GDPR internationally. So I think we've started having this conversation now for the better part of a year and a half of at what point do we just take everything up and set kind of a global standard versus piecemealing it in the US? And I think CPRA has been a big step of that conversation.
And I think just to layer on to that point, the other thing, or another thing that CPRA does is it might offer this alternative of honoring browser level preference signals, which might be attractive, because I know at least early on there were a number of companies or brands that didn't feel comfortable putting a do not sell link on their site, so they would rather avoid selling entirely. So it's possible, it'll be interesting to see whether the expansion of do not sell to do not sell or share remove some taboo. It'll also be interesting to see if any of those browser level mechanisms that might allow brands to circumvent that specifically labeled button come to fruition.
And I might hit on a slightly different angle while we're still on California, but I believe some of the expansion is around the definition of sensitive personal information, and some of that goes beyond what companies would historically do, like looking for a social security number. Technically is not that difficult. As you move into some of these other categories, it becomes a lot more nuanced of how you find sensitive information and how you triangulate different pieces of sensitive information within the organization. So I think there's going to be a much clearer call around governance and how do you understand what you have and how long you're maintaining it. I believe there's another provision in the CPRA around the customer's right to know how long you're keeping their information, and that kind of ties back to historical kind of records management sort of era technology. So I think it's really going to be kind of an interesting change, and for practitioners out there, it's difficult to track all these regulations and decide which one you're going to comply with. And so for us, it's a good call to get your house in order from a data and technological perspective. And we often think about kind of data minimization, and whether you're minimizing by design and you're thinking how you retain and collect data at the outset, which is obviously a great way to do it, or how you're alternatively getting rid of the data that you already have that you shouldn't have, and maybe that's out in the wild, it's not being managed as well. We see that as a significant issue for a lot of our clients.
No, you're right. I mean, it's funny, the conversation drastically changed, with CCPA, but as the picture with CPRA became clearer, and we saw the writing on the wall, we've switched our approach from, really thinking about, the operationalization globally to, what does our data governance look like? What does our information governance look like? We're potentially going to have to publish our data retention practices. We're going to be called to task if somebody wishes to do so. And it's really stepped up the amount of data mapping, privacy engineering that we've had to start doing. And it's changing everything about the way we're practicing and the way that our company's operating. So it's just been, I think, almost a beneficial change. I think anybody on my team would, throw me out a window if they heard me say it was beneficial. But I mean, it's really had to kickstart the conversations that nobody wanted to have. So it's been a very interesting shift.
Yeah, I think, Ross, I like that because it's sort of this, I think you could have played whack-a-mole before with the various regulations and like kind of go after one or another or data hotspots. It feels like the CPRA is requiring people to think much more holistically, and you can't play whack-a-mole and be reactive in that kind of environment where the regulations are that much more extreme.
And so this all brings up sort of a set of interesting questions, right, about moving from sort of a compliance to a governance framework, and thinking about, we've sort of teased up that, I think, Dean, you said, thinking about building either to the ceiling or to the floor, but it's not just necessarily about ceilings or floors, right? It's about some of these frameworks have really different conceptions of what it means for privacy, and just from a philosophical level. And we see that with, GDPR and CCPA, CPRA, of course, with the idea of sale being really differently handled, but also in the states. And, there are some states like Nevada and Maine who have sort of tailored, smaller privacy laws, but some like Washington State and New York who are really conceiving of privacy very differently. And so as you're building to these systems, right, how are you thinking about handling some of these philosophical differences, especially with New York, which might want to require a fiduciary model, or GDPR, which really thinks of privacy differently than CPRA?
Well, I'll start with the basics, and I won't get into the policy, applications as much, but certainly understanding your data and how you retain it and where it exists, and that is surprisingly difficult for a lot of organizations. Where data privacy 20 years ago, in the States was kind of a dead issue. I think there's a Scott McNeely quote about you've got no privacy, kind of get over it. And it's amazing to see how much that's changed in, just 15, 20 years. So I think the organizations are really having to rethink just their information management and governance. And that puts a lot of, until you can do that, you can't layer on the rule sets that say, if it's like this, or if it meets this other factor, I need to handle it with a certain level of care. And so to me, that's the building blocks of this. It's easy to jump right to the DSAR and other sort of end applications. But we're seeing a lot of companies, before they can get to that stage, they've got to start really at the basic level.
I think to build on that point, we've seen a lot of the same thing, but there's also been, again, kind of triggered by CCPA's definition of sale, this really expanded need to understand your sharing of data, who you're sharing it with, what they are doing with it. Sometimes that's not the easiest thing in the world to get transparency on, because to some extent, what partners will do as service providers to help process data, they may not divulge all of, right? So we've been helping our clients to navigate that by understanding from the partners that we're working with how they're using data that they receive from or on behalf of our clients. For example, the biggest discussion of the year has been if there's a pixel on the advertiser site that's passing back data to the partner, what is that? And under CCPA, there were a number of creative evaluations of that. And you have platforms that came up with kind of bespoke solutions to help advertisers or accommodate advertisers' interpretation of their own obligations. So I think, to your point, it's taking that data governance framework and your data mapping exercises and really evolving it to have a deeper understanding of what data you're sharing and what those partners that you're working with are doing with that data as well.
Yeah, and it really has shifted that conversation. I think, Dean, you put it best. It's, do you start with the floor, do you start with the ceiling, or do you start with the house generally? And I think, the way that we've tried to approach this is we saw with CCPA when we were trying to just get our arms around what does our database of California resident data look like. I mean, it took us months, and trying to map out the flows and streams. So we've really been working hard to start from the very top. So anywhere we're ingesting data, you meta tag it, you try to assign it some kind of definition, which becomes very difficult when what's personal data here is not personal information there, is not sensitive here. So we've been trying to think through at this level of what's kind of the best way we could scoop it all together, and really get it before you even start talking about where's it going, which presents its own separate issues down the line.
Yeah, and in terms of understanding the organization's data and flow and handling, one of the things I have seen a lot of companies start with is sort of custodian level interviews, and this whole process of like, let's run around and talk to everyone about how they store and manage their data, which is can be insightful to some extent. We try to take it from the approach of like where the data actually is, and the flows are important, but we also have to kind of map flows with where data really is, because what you find is people don't really know where all their data is, not surprisingly at big organizations, and particularly unstructured data, which tends to have some sprawl in it, and you've got duplicate copies in lots of places they shouldn't be, and that's where you get into a lot of trouble, right? Those are the things the hackers find. And those are the things that get out on the market, and we work with Equifax on their breach remediation, and not saying anything out of school, but a lot of their challenge was data that just they should have had, and they did in the right place, but they also had it in other places, and that's a key issue for lots of clients.
And it really had, I mean, CCPA, for what it is worth, really helped us get our house in order when it comes to US data, because you're right. I mean, 5 years ago, it was still kind of the Wild West. We looked at it as, here's what you do for everyone else, and here's what you do for the US. And, now I think it's really, really made it so you really have to make it all holistic. And for better or for worse, I think it is, as a privacy professional, but also as somebody who likes to get rest at some point, it's tough, but it's really helped push forward this message for executive leadership and maybe other stakeholders that hadn't initially kind of grasped the full concept.
Well, and so, it's interesting to think of privacy as a live issue. And of course, I'm in Washington, where, we've sort of been bickering about it in the Senate and the House for the past couple of years, and not a lot has happened. And so I'm just wondering, we've got a couple more minutes and then we'll go to audience questions. But, as the three of you think about, an incoming administration, of course, the Senate is still up in the air about what's going to happen there. The states don't really show any sign of slowing down in their lanes. Where do you see this going? Do you see more states coming and filling in gaps? Do you see Congress? Do you see the administration taking a role? And how do you see this playing out in the next couple of years? And what does that mean for these governance and forward-looking questions?
Well, I'll start from sort of California-centric, view of the world. It feels like the states are moving so quickly. I don't know how the federal government, even well-intentioned and even organized and getting past all the other things, maybe some of my other panelists will talk about. I just don't know how the federal government keeps up with how aggressive the states are being. From what, just in California, you had one regime that got replaced by another regime within a matter of months. So I don't know how the federal government gets ahead of that.
Yeah, I agree with that. I do think that the momentum for federal legislation is going to continue to grow ahead of 23. CPRA just sets the floor even higher than it was before. And I think that especially with the regs still changing now and trying to plan ahead for CPRA, the patchwork of state laws that are probably going to continue to emerge over the course of that time period, I think it's becoming somewhat untenable. And so I do think that pressure is going to mount, not to mention even amongst the privacy community, that there's criticism of whether CPRA sets the right standard, whether it favors big tech too much, So I think for all of those reasons, we'll see that push for federal legislation, but I agree that it's not going to happen before the states make headway.
Yeah, I mean, I think I think the word of the day or the word of the decade, if you will, is going to be preemption, because, when we think about what an effective federal law looks like, it has to take kind of the GDPR style approach. I mean, you can't be operating within 50 different regimes within the United States, and trying to put some kind of umbrella over that, I mean, is going to be the most effective way. But as we've seen with the various federal laws that have been proposed, and the whether they're consent based, whether they're strictly opt-in based, opt-out based, it's hard to get that kind of traction until until the public is kind of speaking loud enough. And I think with GDPR, even with CPRA, and the various privacy laws emerging in South America and all across Europe and Asia, I think the ripples are coming, and soon enough, you're going to push hard enough that you'll see all these aggressive state approaches that don't quite match up. And I think it's just going to take one of the juggernaut companies getting dinged to really have an effectuating change on what the federal landscape looks like.
Yeah, maybe on to that point, Ross, I'd ask the question is do you see, it feels like it could be almost an enforcement issue where a given act happens and they're liable in one state and not another state, and it's this whole from just a practical standpoint, it will become really cumbersome for the company to operate. It feels like that could be part of the drive eventually.
Well, and I think about this California enforcement body, and if I'm an Apple or a Facebook, I mean, at what point do the other states start feeling like there's encroachment from California enforcement if they eventually have their own body? So I think you're right. The enforcement's where it's going to be the hardest. And it might just become, if companies are facing fines in 20 different states and all of them are 2 to 4% of their annual GDP, I mean, it's just going to be an unlivable situation. And the federal government, for the conversations we've had, for what it is worth, I think sees that writing, and they understand that coming in and having a federal law that sets the standard, at least and preempts where it should, is the effective way. But until we have a more settled, how do I put this nicely, political climate, I think we're going to be looking at kind of the Californias and the Washingtons and New Yorks driving the bus for now.
And so, I mean, preemption is one of the big watchwords. I think enforcement is also one of them. The other, I think, ends up being opt-in and opt-out, and the states have not been consistent at all about that. And I guess my question is, you said the federal government should maybe preempt where it ought to, and so maybe my question to you guys is where from a compliance and governance perspective is it sort of, you're saying state by state is maybe it costs a little more, but it's doable. Maybe it's a little more tricky, but it's doable. Where should the federal government be stepping in these questions?
I mean, I think if you're really thinking through where the step in is, I mean, I like the GDPR model. Maybe I'm one of the only ones where, kind of federally we have mandates on how personal information, or definition of personal information, one. So I think setting the guardrails. What is it? How should you handle it? What rights do you have? And then, similar to the GDPR, you still give the states their chance to have any kind of sectoral privacy laws that they need, based on local economies, or based on whatever the prevailing market might be in their state. I think we're still not going to get away from separate banking regulations and health regulations, and being a financial services company, the financial regulations are all going to be, I think, kind of set aside from anything federal. So having at least a benchmarked standard of what are we calling personal information, what rights should we have as an entire country, and really how should that be managed? Should it be a federal enforcement body that has arms into the states, or do you have state enforcement bodies? I can't say, but I think at least having a unified standard would help everybody realign.
I would agree we should, find that consensus. I just, maybe after the last month or so of how divided the country is on everything, it feels like we almost might need a number of years of kind of thrashing this problem out before people really come to the table and say, we've got to get on the same page, because it's too painful otherwise. But I feel like we're probably a long way away from that.
Yeah, I mean, unfortunately, when I think through it, it's probably years. And some number of, rotating political leaders away. But I am, if nothing else, encouraged by what I'm seeing, maybe not necessarily in the laws themselves, but in the local interaction and the at least interest in personal, information compliance, trying to get that set to a global standard. Because in the U.S., I think I've said it before that before it was like, oh, I get $10 here, have all my information, or I get 20% off, you can have my information. Like, we always took the capitalistic approach, which just kind of goes with kind of how America came up. But I think people are finally seeing that the ripples coming from from Europe and from Asia and from South America are really going to start changing the direction that everybody's focusing on.
So I'm going to move now. We've got just a whole host of audience questions. So I'm going to move us into some of those, and they sort of dovetail with some of the questions I had. So I'm going to use my moderator's prerogative to tweak them as I like. But we have talked a lot about California, and we've talked a little bit about some of the other states, both who have laws on the books already and who are thinking about passing laws, and some are more successful than others. And this is sort of a couple questions smushed together, but what are the states, if any, that are really thinking about maybe rivaling or not sitting back and letting California take the lead? And coupled with that, what is the sort of stance for a company that is operating across the United States? Is it just CCPA, CPRA by default? Are there places where you're compliant in one jurisdiction but not the other? And how are those two sort of playing together?
Yeah, so I can kick off. So I think, we did spend a lot of time talking about California today, but it is kind of with reason, right? If you look at Nevada as an example, the way they define sale is so much more narrow. What they're considering to be covered information is narrower. And so that's kind of why CCPA has to date been the de facto floor. You do have momentum in Washington. In addition, and this one to me is probably the most interesting to watch, the New York Privacy Act and that element of the potential creation of a fiduciary obligation where companies would need to be fiduciaries for the data under their control. That one, I think, is probably the most the one that stands out the most in terms of raising that bar even higher than California has. And so that one's going to be interesting to watch. But because it is such a radical departure, I also think that's why it has not been successful to date.
Yeah, no, I think you're absolutely right. New York and Washington, I think, are the two big, and New York probably, just by sheer size and kind of political sway, is probably your next big juggernaut contender. And it's not just size; it's, as Ariel said, the various changes, even between the CPRA and the proposed New York Privacy Act, are pretty staggering when you think about it from a business compliance perspective. I think right now, CCPA or CPRA, it has to be your kind of gold standard in the U.S. But as more of these laws come into play, and as more of them are different from the others, it's going to be hard to do a gap analysis and plug all the holes in each state. And I think you see companies, larger companies like your Googles and Microsofts, making statements that this is it. One privacy law means that we're just doing it in the U.S. And I think we'll fight it for a while, but eventually you're going to have to benchmark up to a higher standard, and just have some kind of global compliance. And I use global kind of sparingly for those companies that are just US based, but you're going to have to think about how this looks in a kind of layered operational format, because you'll drive yourself crazy if you don't.
And isn't one of the challenges, I mean, both of you mentioned it, but it's tempting to think of like the bar being raised higher, but it's really that the standards are different. Some are higher and more stringent kind of generally, but they're just different definitionally. And so you can't just sort of build kind of to the highest mark. And I think that's going to really frustrate a lot of practitioners, is that you can't just put belt and suspenders on and keep going higher, because higher will only help you in some instances, but because you'll get caught with the differences. I think, Ross, you mentioned kind of the gap assessment is just, you could get caught with something lower that's just different in another state and still have, liability or other exposure.
Yeah, I think to your point, Dean, and also to your point before about data governance, that's really the key to all of this, right? Because once you understand the data that you're processing and who you're sending it to and how you're sending it to them and what they're using it for, it's a matter of having the right tech infrastructure to be able to adapt, and that's what's going to dictate how nimble or how much your rules or policies differ by jurisdiction, right? So to date, I think that by necessity, companies may have looked to what's the most stringent thing that I need to comply with today. Let me move towards that. But I think as we move forward, we will start to see a refinement in approach as we're no longer kind of flying while building the plane on data mapping exercises and the like. I think we'll find a more space to take a more refined approach.
Yeah, I think I need to steal that flying while building the plane, because for a year and a half or 2 years after GDPR, that's what it felt like. And you're right. I see it now on the international side where there was panic. There was, you shut down everything you don't understand. But as we start coming into the norms, things are loosening up. We're figuring out where enforcement actually is, where the focus is for the public, and how we can still remain on the forefront of ingenuity while still, respecting individuals' right to privacy.
And maybe I'll just jump in here, and I'm going to out myself briefly as being on the policy side and not the operational side by how I perhaps messily paraphrase this question. But there seem to be a couple different questions that are talking about, like, look, it's one thing when you're saying you're collecting my data as I visit your website today, and you sort of have that built up in a structure, and that goes to a place in a way that is compliant and is stored in a way that's compliant. And if I call you, you'll give me access to it and all that. What about data that you've had for 20 years, right? Where you maybe don't know where it came from, you don't know whose it is, you don't know what regime it might be under, or it's just sitting in a database or a CSV or whatever somewhere, and people are asking you, like, what do I do with this? What do I do with this under GDPR, under CPRA? How about that? What's that sort of challenge look like?
I think the elephant in the room here, and I alluded to it before in my comments earlier, was 20 years ago, in the States, we didn't care at all about data privacy. We cared about IT and redundancy and hoarding information under the auspices that data was this new oil, and maybe the algorithms will eventually catch up, and we'll just grab it all and we'll figure it out later. And I won't give any judgment about whether that's a good or bad idea, but that was the prevailing thought. And then now you take companies that have all that data, and they built systems to create redundancy in 74 copies of everything, because that's what we were more worried about losing a PowerPoint that somebody had for a presentation, and we have 17 copies of it in disaster recovery and business continuity. And that was our philosophical bent. And I think that's just at loggerheads with any notions of data privacy, because all that redundancy leads to duplication and triviality and where you store it, and the mess that most companies have. And so to me, that's the really heavy lift, is to change how we think about information management, not even governance, but just sort of information within an organization, because that's going to be the big philosophical change in my mind. And you're going to have to undo what could be decades or longer of data hoarding that was done just to make sure we had access to everything.
Well, and you don't want to be the company that somebody submits their request to, and you find all this current data, and then, oh yeah, also we have something from 15 or 20 years ago. What we've had to do is you really rethink the structure of collection generally. And we've taken these You know, the policies of privacy by design, though strictly required in Europe, have fundamental, like foundational place in the development of our products and services now, because it's not just let's do it in Europe. It's you really should only be collecting whatever you need. We can still make products that are, desirable. You should really be deleting it when you don't need it anymore. And you really shouldn't be keeping data for 10, 15 years. Because you're right, that's where, I mean, that's the scary piece. I think somebody said, that's what scares them and that's what keeps them up at night. And when asked the question, that's usually one of my answers is it's the amount of data. It's the known unknowns. Because that there's data there that nobody can find, and mergers and acquisitions, and there's just a server probably sitting somewhere. So you're right. It's really rethinking this concept of it's personal, but like let's step back and how do we just wrangle in the collection piece?
Yeah, I think even kind of to your point there, Ross, almost you talk about privacy by design, but I think to some extent you need minimization by design. We have to sort of get our heads around this more of a minimalistic kind of collection and then retention. And like the second, you even see this some with some of the ephemeral data messaging systems, like do we need to keep instant messages, internal, informal correspondence for all time? Or should some of that just kind of go away magically? And I think there's be some interesting sort of changes in thoughts about how we change kind of corporate memory and information, collection at the front end, I think, as you were talking about.
So I think there's another bundle of questions that I think we were hoping to get to in our initial chat, but we can get to here, which is sort of the international GDPR versus CPRA question. And so there are a couple of questions talking about, just what are the differences, and maybe just a brief fleshing out of sort of the philosophical and policy differences, but then also in relation to Schrems, right? And we've seen that, sort of the transfer mechanism of the privacy shield is not going to be there. Is, if a company moves to being compliant with CPRA, is that, is California an adequate jurisdiction? Is that going to be something that could fill the void? Is that something that you're talking about with your clients at all?
So I can kick this one off. So in terms of the differences, at the risk of sounding like a broken record, Ccpa introduced this new concept of the sale of personal information, and it defined what constitutes a sale very, very broadly. And that's kind of been the area of debate. GDPR was about having a lawful basis for processing. And so, yes, in some circumstances, explicit consent would be required. In other instances, you saw companies early on relying on legitimate interest across a broader range of processing activities. That debate between, like, is legitimate interest appropriate in this for this processing, or is consent is very similar to the debate that we've seen play out in the U.S. whether this is a sale or not, and it's all kind of hinging on the same issues. So that's kind of been the key difference. With CPRA, it'll get more specific around some of the business purposes for which data can be shared with service providers. Service provider is essentially like processor under GDPR. So you're going to continue to see that be refined, but that's really been the key difference. So where your cookie banner in Europe would allow someone to opt in, facilitate that opt in, if you're deploying something similar to comply with CCPA, how do you adapt that same technology to honor like an opt-out of sale preference signal? Are you opting them out of all tracking because is that what you consider to be a sale, or are you able to refine the use cases more? And so that's kind of been the operational difference that we've seen.
I'm just glad somebody brought up Schrems too, because I've been like wanting to explode it out of me for some reason, because it's what we focused on. I do think that's going to be a substantial player in what a federal law looks like. You see now there's talks about a new and updated privacy shield, but I mean, the EU courts were pretty clear that until we wrangle in the way in which the government accesses personal information, we're not going to be identified as a adequate jurisdiction. And you see the conversations about California maybe getting this adequacy determination. If that happens, I think that will starkly change the direction that a federal conversation has, because how do I comply with that as a if I'm importing data, our servers, though we might have servers in California, it might go to our servers in New York or in Virginia. And I think at that point companies are going to start pushing at the federal level with whether it be lobbyists or just generally, you'll have executives of these companies pushing for an adequate singular law that gives us the ability to just continue business as usual. So I think the one thing that drives the United States privacy laws to be somewhat different from what we see in Europe may also actually end up being the thing that drives us to be the same eventually, because what it comes down to is the ability to do business for a lot of these companies. And I think the fringe benefit of that for the rest of us is going to be that privacy is going to be the main consideration.
Well, we've just got a couple minutes left, and I want to just make sure that all of you get just a chance, if you have any closing thoughts or things that you're really thinking about in the next couple of years moving forward, that you all get a chance to have those out. So I guess, Dean, do you want to just, any final thoughts?
I think throughout, it just starts with understanding your data. It's surprising how many organizations do not understand their data. And I think you've got to start there before you layer in all the policy nuances and the rules and exceptions, state by state and internationally. So that's really where we see most of our customers start, is understanding what you've got. And then as you start looking into your data repositories, you're going to find a lot of redundant, obsolete, and trivial data, and you want to clean that up anyway. To Ross's point, you don't want to be digging around and finding things that are out there that are going to haunt you, down the road. And there's lots of use cases for that, whether it's data privacy or e-discovery or mergers and acquisitions, whatever it might be. There's never been a better clarion call to really understand your data estate and start to think more purposefully about how you retain and manage your data.
Ariel, any final thoughts?
Yeah, I think to build on that, and once that data mapping exercise is done and refreshed and accounting for sensitive PI as newly defined under CPRA and all of those things, I think it's really about using this runway up to 2023 with CPRA to take advantage of the opportunity to refine your approach. Where you were trying to have a global standard or a single standard, are there opportunities for you to evolve your tech infrastructure to support a more refined approach? Does that benefit you? And in doing so, it's certainly about the concept of data minimization, but it's also about taking a responsible approach to the use of that. Don't stop at collection. It's really about evaluating the way that you're going to use that data and whether it's responsible and fair from your consumer's perspective.
Ross, any final thoughts?
Yeah, I think you can't wait for a federal law as much as all of us want to. Dean and Ariel, I think what you said is absolutely right, is you build the foundation, know what you have, know what's going, and then you can layer on it. This has been our operational approach since before GDPR, where we want to have it where the baseline and you can just plug in where you have gaps. It doesn't always work that way, but once you have that foundational approach in place, complying with these new laws becomes less of a fire drill and more of just business as usual.
Well, thank you all so much, Ross, Ariel, Dean, for taking time and spending it with us today. And thank you so much to our hosts, PrivSec Global and Lauren, for introducing us. And I'm not actually sure how this ends. So I'll just say thank you, and we really enjoyed our time.